I'm sure we all remember the now widely discredited BBC Panorama programme Is Labour Anti-Semitic? A classic piece of anti-Corbyn propaganda, if there ever was one. Questions raised about BBC Panorama episode on Labour and anti-Semitism. Even the BBC themselves now admit there were major problems with this episode of Panorama. BBC admits grossly misleading edits in infamous Panorama programme. BBC admits to editing out crucial information from Is Labour Anti-Semitic Panorama? Well, perhaps it's time the BBC asked themselves the same question. Is the BBC anti-Semitic? At the present time, we have a situation where a major Tory party donor, judging by the amounts of cash involved, is calling for a black woman to be shot. We also have an ongoing genocide in Gaza with the implicit, if not actually explicit, support of both Sunak and Starmer. So, who does the BBC point the "you are a Nazi" finger at? Yep, you've guessed it. The Muslim guy who's not taking any money from a donor that wants black women shot and who's spoken out consistently against the genocide currently taking place in Gaza. First Minister Humza Yousaf brands Israel's actions in Gaza tantamount to ethnic cleansing. It was Kaye Adams of Loose Women fame and a presenter on BBC Radio Scotland who was doing the finger pointing. Now, just before we have a listen to what she said, let's have a little background context to justify why I think she can be accused of anti-Semitism and by extension her employer, the BBC, can be accused of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism can manifest itself in many ways. One of the most pernicious, according to several organisations combating anti-Semitism, is Holocaust trivialization. Holocaust trivialization is a form of anti-Semitism. Holocaust trivialization refers to any comparison or analogy that diminishes the scale and severity of the atrocities that were carried out by Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. So, Holocaust trivialization means taking the ideas and the language of the greatest war crime, the greatest atrocity committed in the 20th century, the extermination of 6 million Jews, taking that language, taking those ideas and misappropriating them, applying them to a relatively trivial situation that bears no comparison with what Jewish people actually suffered in Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. To do this, to carry out that type of trivialization, it is anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic in result and quite possibly anti-Semitic in intent as well. Now, the words that you hear Kaye Adams saying in this clip, they are the words of one of her listeners who has messaged into the show. But that doesn't matter. I mean, these words, this wasn't some nutter who had managed to get themselves on air, then began spouting all this rubbish. Kaye Adams and the producer must have, in the cold light of day, in advance, read these comments and decided that they should be read out on air. Here's what she said.
Humza Yousaf wants Scotland to be Tory-free as he sees the Conservatives as a stumbling block to independence. If he gets his way, what next? A Labour Party free zone, etc., etc. Slowly getting rid of all political opposition. This is the rhetoric of the 1930s, says John. What about the 700,000 Scots who vote Conservative? Are their political viewpoints to be marginalised from Scottish society and ultimately banned from expressing their opinion? Is this Humza's final solution for dealing with the Tory problem?
Yes, it seems, according to some, Humza Yousaf is planning a Third Reich-style final solution to the problem of Scottish Tory voters. Kaye Adams is under fire after reading out a text comparing the SNP's Tory-free election slogan to Hitler's final solution. The BBC Scotland presenter's decision to read out the insane comments live on the radio has been described as shameful. So, what is it that's got John, a Tory voter presumably, so hot under the collar? Well, Humza Yousaf has said that one of the things he would like to see after the next general election is a Tory-free Scotland. Now, when he used that phrase, a Tory-free Scotland, it was perfectly clear that he was talking about defeating the Tories at the ballot box, as in making sure there were no Scottish Tory MPs. He was clearly not meaning or in any way suggesting that all Scottish Tory voters should somehow be exterminated. Humza Yousaf has claimed that most Scottish seats in the next general election are a straight fight between the SNP and Tories. The SNP leader was speaking at a spring event in Perth, where members and delegates have been discussing policy and the upcoming election. Mr Yousaf called on members to make history by making Scotland Tory-free. Now, there are many criticisms that can be made of the SNP. I'm sure there's plenty of die-hard, lifelong SNP voters that could have and will have criticisms of the SNP. But to suggest that Humza Yousaf is some kind of new Adolf Hitler planning some sort of purge of all Scottish Conservative voters is just preposterous beyond words. But it's actually worse than that because it is actually anti-Semitic. It's clearly trivialising the Holocaust. The thought of Scottish Tory MPs losing their seats and there not being a Scottish Tory MP in Scotland, the idea of that being equivalent to what 6 million Jews suffered in Nazi Germany is just insulting. It's anti-Semitic and it insults the memory of those who suffered and perished in Nazi Germany. And Kaye should hang her head in shame for having read those comments out on air. It's also worth mentioning that Tories have apparently called for the SNP to be eradicated and nobody called them Nazis, and nobody called Labour Nazis for wanting to get rid of all Tories. So also, a few words for John, if by any chance you happen to watch this podcast. Firstly, take a long, deep, slow breath. Believe me, SNP stormtroopers are not going to be turning up at your door in the middle of the night, rounding up you and your fellow Tory voters and marching you off to some sort of internment camp. That is just not going to happen. And secondly, John, I was particularly struck by what you said here.
What about the 700,000 Scots who vote Conservative? Are their political viewpoints to be marginalised?
Now, John, it's not impossible that the Scottish Conservatives will be left with no MPs after the next general election. And you're right when you say that that would mean that 700,000, presumably get the same number of votes as 2019. That would mean that approximately 700,000 voters would be left voiceless, marginalised, and with no representation in Westminster. But you know what? That is how the first past the post electoral system works. John, do you have any idea about the fact that the thousands and thousands of Green voters in this country are just one MP away from being totally disenfranchised when it comes to a voice in Westminster and being represented in Westminster? That is how the first past the post system works. It's totally unfair. So my advice to you, John, would be rather than ranting and raving about final solutions and Nazis and all the rest of it, join the campaign for proportional representation. And that way we can make sure that both you and your fellow Scottish Conservatives and the hundreds of thousands of Green voters right across the country are fairly represented in the House of Commons. Because that's the way forward, that's the way to fix the democratic deficit, and that's what we should all be working towards. Please help support Left Wing Voices on social media by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and chat again soon.